Доброго ранку. Good morning, everyone. I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce Danielle Bell, who is the new head of mission of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Ms. Bell will make a short opening statement, and then we'll take questions from the audience here and from those joining us online. During the question and answer session, please identify yourself before asking the question. My name is Krystianowski. I'm the spokesperson for the mission. Thank you very much. Danielle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to all of you for joining us today, and also thanks to those of you who are joining us online. On behalf of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, or the HRMMU, welcome to the release of the 36th Periodic Report on the human rights situation in Ukraine. The report covers the period from the 1st of February to the 31st of July of this year. The report and its findings are based on data collected during field missions, detention visits, trial monitoring, as well as remote monitoring of occupied territory. Its findings draw from 1,226 interviews with victims, witnesses, survivors, their relatives, lawyers, government representatives, civil society, and other interlocutors, and information from court documents, official records, and relevant material. The full-scale armed attack by the Russian Federation against Ukraine continues to have a devastating impact across the country. Between 1st February and July 31st of this year, hostilities killed at least 1,028 civilians and injured 3,593. That is, on average, nearly 6 civilians killed and 20 injured every single day. The majority of the casualties, 86%, took place in government-controlled territory and therefore were likely a result of attacks carried out by the Russian Federation. Explosive weapons with wide area effects caused more than 90% of the casualties, with a significant number of civilian casualties on both sides near the front line being killed or injured by explosive weapons, such as multiple launch rocket systems, which should not be used in populated areas. Cluster munitions also caused dozens of civilian casualties in government-controlled territory. The use of cluster munitions in populated areas poses significant risks to civilians due to their indiscriminate and potentially disproportionate effects and the high risk of unexploded submunitions. Also, hundreds of civilians were killed or injured by missiles and loitering munitions far from the front lines in waves of attacks launched by the Russian armed forces. These attacks also caused widespread destruction of essential civilian infrastructure. For example, since the beginning of July, at least 25 Russian attacks damaged or destroyed infrastructure associated with grain export. These strikes significantly affect the livelihoods of people working in the agricultural sector, with compound effects on the rights of those living in rural farming communities. HRMMU has continued to document cases of arbitrary detention and the widespread use of torture and ill treatment against civilians and prisoners of war by Russian authorities. Since February 2022, we have recorded the arbitrary detention of nearly 1,000 people in occupied territories. During this reporting period, we documented 43 such cases, though the actual number is likely higher, much higher, due to verification delays. Approximately 90% of the detainees we interviewed reported experiencing torture and ill treatment during their detention. This pattern also extended to prisoners of war. The testimonies of survivors describe unimaginable cruelty, including terrifying accounts of severe beatings, which in some cases led to broken bones and smashed teeth. Often, detainees experienced torture at several facilities. During the reporting period, some Russian POWs described instances of torture and ill treatment by Ukrainian authorities shortly after captured, which ceased upon arrival at official detention centers. The report urges UN member states to demand that Russian authorities grant access to independent observers at all detention and internment facilities. In contrast, HRMMU has full access to Russian POWs in Ukraine, where we have also observed improvements in their treatment, as set out in the report. Russian authorities persisted in consolidating administrative systems in occupied territories, which encompassed elections, schools, hospitals, and courts, while imposing Russian law in the recently occupied territories. This process resembled what occurred in Crimea almost a decade ago. For example, occupying authorities additionally cultivated a coercive environment, leaving residents with little alternative but to acquire Russian passports. Those lacking Russian passports faced potential job loss, in addition to restricted access to essential services such as medical care, education, and social benefits. Moreover, they were subjected to prolonged scrutiny and risked detention at checkpoints. In areas that have been liberated, Ukrainian authorities have initiated almost 6,000 criminal cases against individuals accused of collaborating with the occupying power. Our monitoring revealed that many of those detained and even convicted were targeted for activities that in principle could be compelled by the occupying power under international humanitarian law. This includes individuals who work to ensure the continued operation of social services and schools. Often, those we interviewed stated that they had only agreed to work after being threatened by the occupying authorities. They also described an atmosphere of pervasive fear during the occupation, compounded by their isolation from government-controlled territory. The report recommends a thorough review of existing collaboration laws, grounded in provisions of international humanitarian law and considering the realities of life under occupation. Since 2022, OHCHR has documented 8 situations in which hundreds of children were transferred to the Russian Federation or to other places in occupied territories. While the number of transferred children is unclear, it is obviously much higher. While some children have returned, many of those who were transferred to the Russian Federation remain there. The Russian Federation has not yet established a functioning mechanism to identify these children and to trace their family links to ensure that they are reunited with their loved ones. The report reiterates the need to reinforce efforts to compile detailed, complete, and consistent data about these children and to establish a system for returning them. The report highlights the long-term impact of the war on the human rights situation, with vulnerable groups particularly affected. For example, mines and ERW killed 70 civilians and injured 248 during the reporting period, most of them in the spring as farmers began cultivating their land. With approximately 30% of Ukraine's territory exposed to intense and in many areas prolonged fighting, efforts to eliminate the threat of explosive ordnance must continue to be supported. The report emphasizes the catastrophic consequences of the Kakhovka Dam breach, which triggered an environmental disaster severely impacting local communities and jeopardizing the rights of tens of thousands of people to an adequate standard of living, as well as to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. In addition, the war has pushed millions of Ukrainians into poverty. Groups in vulnerable situations, especially older persons and persons with disabilities, risk experiencing further marginalization. The report urges efforts to address the long-term effects of the war, with a particular focus on reaching vulnerable groups who have been disproportionately affected. Accountability for crimes is crucial to prevent their reoccurrence and provide justice for victims. So far, there has been very little progress. OHCHR continues to document additional cases of serious human rights violations which took place before this reporting period, confirming patterns of previously identified, including killings of civilians, enforced disappearances and torture of both civilians and prisoners of war. The Russian Federation committed the vast majority of these violations and have taken no discernible steps to ensure accountability for violations committed by its own security forces. On the contrary, a new law adopted in June 2023 effectively grants amnesty to Russian service persons for an overly broad range of crimes, reinforcing an atmosphere of impunity. While Ukrainian authorities have launched investigations into violations committed by members of their own security forces, limited progress has been reported. In conclusion, the 36th Periodic Report underscores the ongoing and devastating toll of the war on civilians. It reinforces the demand from the UN General Assembly for the Russian Federation to immediately cease its armed attack on Ukraine. Additionally, the report offers a set of concrete recommendations that, if implemented, would substantially improve human rights protection. The report is available online both through OHCHR's and HRMMU's website, and the Ukrainian and Russian translations will be uploaded in the coming days. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Before we pass on to the Q&A session, bear with us for a couple of seconds while we put our headphones on. Thank you.
Добрий день, Дмитро Дідора.
Dmitro Didura Espresso Channel. You have mentioned that 6,000 cases. Can you hear me? You have mentioned about Can you hear me now? Yes. Good morning. Dmitro Didura Espresso Television Channel. Good morning. Dmitro Didura Espresso Channel. You have mentioned almost 6,000 criminal cases were initiated for collaborating, and you have mentioned that we need to revise the legislation. Can you give us more detailed explanation or account on the cases when these cases were perhaps initiated improperly, in your opinion? They violate human rights and people were just forced to do their job. For instance, like employees of schools and other social public institutions, apart from the cases of extreme collaborationism. And you've mentioned that more 1,000 civilians were killed, most probably from attacks of the Russian Federation. So monitoring mission assumes that civilians are being killed as a result of the Ukrainian attacks? Thank you so much for your answer.
Much. So, you've asked two questions. One of the questions was on the number of civilian casualties, and the second question, or the first question, was on the law and collaboration activities. So in the report, it documents multiple instances where individuals who were living in occupied territories were compelled or forced to work for the Russian Federation, often performing civilian functions, including, teachers, administrative authorities. And upon deoccupation, many of them were investigated and subjected to prosecutions and convictions. And in the report, it documents some clear examples of that. On the question of civilian casualties, so let me be specific. So between the 1st of February and July 31st, this war caused at least 1,028 civilian deaths and injured 3,593. The vast majority, or 86%, took place in government-occupied or government-controlled territory, and therefore were likely the result of attacks by the Russian Federation. Thank you.
Можете також прокоментувати
Could you also comment on the attacks on ports infrastructure? As of recently, Russian Federation caused 25 strikes, and in your opinion, will some kind of grain agreement will be performed under the monitoring of the UN agency, and how do these rights being violated? For example, please, could you please explain by way of examples?
Used to monitor and document the civilian casualties and related harm resulting from the attacks in the ports. This report covers up to the 31st of July, so doesn't include the recent attacks. At the same time, in terms of the attacks targeting grain infrastructure, they are having a devastating effect both on the local economy, farming communities, as well as the civilian casualties, and additionally have implications for global food security. In terms of the resumption of the Black Sea grain agreement, this is, in higher levels of discussion and outside specifically what's covered in the report. Thank you. And attendance at this incredibly important event, and I wish you all a good day.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Thank you all for coming, and whoever joined us online, thank you for joining us online. Thank you. Bye.